Hello and welcome, fellow lifelong learners. Thanks for joining me for One More Thing, a radio show all about cultivating our most valuable asset, our mind, and fostering a sense of curiosity to learn one more thing. We feature passionate practitioners and seasoned experts in numerous areas of interest for lifelong learners of all ages. One More Thing is sponsored by Kiffin & Company, a corporate learning and talent development consulting firm, and I'm your host, Kiffin McCoy Albert, a certified professional in talent development, learning advocate, and your fellow lifelong learner. Welcome to the show. When I think of bees, I think of three things. First, the 90s movie My Girl, tragic as it was. Two, on a happier note, honey. And three, products like lip balm and candles made with beeswax. I personally have never thought about being a beekeeper, but I really like eating and using products made locally, so I have had an appreciation for local beekeepers for a long time. My guest today is one of many hobbyist beekeepers who enjoy tending hives, harvesting honey, and sharing their knowledge and goods for their own enjoyment, not as a business. I'll be back with Dr. David Loucky right after this.
Maximize impact with tailored solutions by partnering with Kiffin & Company. Developing your team is an investment, but it doesn't have to be just an expense. Discover more at kiffinandcompany.com and start your journey to effective learning today.
Dr. David Loucky is a professor and professional musician. He and his wife Nancy are transplants to Middle Tennessee from upstate New York. Dave has been a professor of trombone for over 3 decades at Middle Tennessee State University. He's performed and lectured internationally, is an active performer with the Nashville Symphony, the New Hampshire Music Festival, and for 2 seasons as assistant principal trombonist with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. And he can be heard on numerous recordings and video game projects produced in Nashville studios. And that is only a very brief synopsis. However, his incredible career and musical talents are actually not what we're talking about today. Dave and his wife, Nancy, have been beekeepers since 2013, and he's going to share today a little bit about how they got started, lessons that they've learned, and how they continue to share their passion with others. So Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
Awesome. Well, I think the first question is pretty obvious, is how does a talented, successful musician and trombone professor become interested in bees?
That's an interesting question. We get that asked a lot, and our kids grew up and left the house, went to college, and settled elsewhere. And so we like to say that we replaced them with about 200,000 bees in our yard. And actually, it wasn't like that. It's just one colony thing. We thought this would be a fun hobby, and I had a colleague at Middle Tennessee State that had bees in their backyard, and it just was a curiosity. We'd go over to their house and noticed that they weren't nervous about bees, and we thought, well, maybe we shouldn't be nervous about bees. So we start asking questions, and it just kept going from there. And in the suburbs here, we live in the suburbs of Murfreesboro, we decided we wanted to do more edible landscaping. So we were starting to plant some fruit trees and had a front yard garden and things like that. So we thought, bees sort of go along with all of that. We were composting in the backyard, and all of that sort of kind of was part of our new life after kids.
So you said that you started with one colony, but then you also mentioned 200,000 bees. So for those of us like me, I know a little about bees, but really not a lot. So with one colony, how many bees is that on average?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer to almost every question when it comes to beekeeping is, it depends. It always starts with, it depends. So when you first begin, you usually start with a package of bees, which is maybe they do it by weight when you order a package of bees. You get about 3 pounds of bees and a mated queen. And you install this package, comes in a box with screens on it, and you install it in your box, your beekeeping equipment. And so that might only be maybe 8,000 bees. That sounds like a lot to just anybody, but it's really not enough to do very much from the standpoint of pollination or making a lot of honey or something like that. So as they grow in numbers, at their peak, a colony might have as many as 50,000 bees. One single colony would have that many. Led by one queen. You wouldn't typically have more than one queen, and a bunch of workers. Probably 90% of the bees are female worker bees, and about 10 to 20% would be drones, the male drones that don't do a lot of work, but they're just kind of around eating honey and being cared for a little bit and raised in the eventuality that queens in the area need to be mated. And it's a sign of a healthy colony. So, yeah, in answer to your question, a colony is anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 bees at their peak.
And reiterate if you said it and I just didn't process it, but reiterate what's the dependency? Like, why would a colony be 20,000 versus 50,000?
Well, again, it depends on what time of year
Okay.
you're in. So a colony is going to evolve in terms of numbers and strength. And so the population will grow in the early spring and build up from the overwintered bees, which is a very small cluster, probably about the size of a softball, maybe as small as that. And then gradually each 3-week production period, as the queen is laying new eggs, every 3 weeks, there's another cycle of bees that will emerge and become bigger and bigger. And that creates more heat energy in the colony. And eventually you get to a point where, you know, they overrun the size of their box. They're too congested and they want to reproduce. That's happening in the early, for us in Tennessee, it happens, they'll want to swarm. The word swarming has a bad connotation, but it's just their way of reproducing. One colony will split itself, create a new queen. The old queen typically will fly with a bunch of bees and find another location to live. And the old colony that's left behind will have queen cells that are developing, and they'll continue to raise a new queen that hopefully will get mated and continue the colony in its original location. So that's all happening here without getting too much into the technicalities. It happens in our area in March and April and into May. That's all swarm season for us. So that's a natural thing. It's all the important part of the organism, the superorganism, is to be able to reproduce and create a new colony somewhere else.
Oh, very cool. So, oh gosh, you're making me think of all these rapid fire questions. But so number one, I want to go back to, you mentioned that the 90% of the colony is worker bees. And you said that those are they all female, or they tend to be all female?
They are all female. And the queen, of course, is female. The only difference genetically between the queen and the worker bees is how the queen was raised. So the egg that she came from was originally a fertilized worker egg, a female egg. And then the worker bees that were nurturing and feeding that developing larva fed that particular larva a high diet of protein, what we call royal jelly, and just fed it so that it became a much bigger worker, if you want to think of it as still a worker, but it's an elongated, it turns out to be a queen, and it's a much larger cell. So that queen emerges in record time, in a very small amount of time compared to worker bees. And then she'll come out and she'll, at some point, several days later, she'll be fed and she'll be strong enough and she'll figure out how to fly, and she'll get out and get mated and hopefully return mated and ready to lead the colony in terms of raising new bees.
Do we know why a particular larva is chosen, or it's just the part of the nature they just do choose one?
Yeah, a lot of times a colony will make numerous queen cells at the same time, and they'll typically not use all of them. Some of them will get torn down and they won't persist to adulthood. But sometimes you'll see a bunch of virgins in a colony that are running around, and they'll eventually usually attack each other, and usually one will become the head of the nest.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize it was so vicious. I guess that's what happens with the royal seat, though, right?
Exactly. Long live the queen.
Yeah, right. So you did not have any prior really knowledge of bees when you started this. So obviously you have self-educated, and then I know we talked about that you started off belonging to a local county organization, and they had a course that you took on beekeeping. So is that really how you educated yourself, was just through YouTube or whatever, and then this association?
Yeah, there's YouTube helps a little bit, but there's so much information out there that it's hard to figure out what the best sites are. But and beekeeping is really a very localized thing. What happens here in Middle Tennessee is not always going to apply to somebody who's in a drier climate or a wetter climate where they have just completely different forage times. So yeah, what we did was we did kind of dive in. I ordered bees. We started going to the local meetings of our county association. And that's totally an important thing, because you get to talk to and listen to some of the older, more seasoned beekeepers that know a lot more and have experienced a lot more. and they can give you tips, and you can also get information about where to access materials and get more educated. So we started with that, and they did offer just a 3-day course, 2 nights and a Saturday morning. That was all it was. But it's like certain, when you jump into something like this, you can get enough information to get yourself in trouble. And so it's like drinking from the fire hose. We would be listening to someone do a talk, and we didn't know the nomenclature. We didn't have definitions of things that were being said. And we're both educated people. We have graduate degrees, but we didn't obviously know enough. You really should do a lot more reading than we did before we started. But I came home one day and I had accompanied my colleague to buy some equipment for his colonies. And I came back and I told Nancy that, okay, well, I bought the bees. They're going to be here. They're going to be here in May. So we got to get our equipment set up. And she was freaking out. So yeah, it started with monthly meetings with the local association, a short course. And then it's hands-on, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And you pretty much, almost nothing. You just know how to maybe move a frame around, and you're looking at a frame and you're not even sure, what are the worker bees? Can I find a queen? What are these other big animals in there doing that are the drones that are much larger? So you're trying to learn as much as you can in a short period of time. It's really helpful if you have a mentor that you can take advantage of. And we didn't really have that right away, but we became mentors to others over the course of a few years.
Yeah, I went on and looked at the county association Facebook page just to kind of see what did they have on there. And it looked like they had lots of tips and reminders, which is nice. People can go on. So I would think that other people within the association would be a great resource to, if you did run into a problem or had a question, just like you all have become mentors to others and answered those similar questions, I'm sure. And then you said that you have mentored others. So the county association is kind of where you started, but then you and I think you said you and another couple, you and your wife and another couple started an association of beekeepers within your church community, correct?
Yep, that's right. At St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Murfreesboro, there's I want to say 3 families now that are beekeepers, and so some of the kids are involved. Mostly it's the adults, and we share information back and forth. We try to remind some of the newer beekeepers what they might want to be considering to do in a particular month of the year, because it might not come to their mind normally. I mean, where we were making mistakes for 3 or 4 years, we're trying to help other people avoid some of those mistakes. And then another thing that we did in order to learn more is to have a subscription to one of the bee magazines. And so there's the American Bee Journal, ABJ, and there's also Bee Culture. Those are a couple of really good journals that come out with monthly editions. And then there's also Tennessee Beekeepers Association has an annual symposium for 2 days, and that happens now in October on the MTSU campus. So that's something we have taken advantage of for a couple of years. There's other national symposiums that are bigger than that. If you want to really get into it, you really could learn a lot.
Gotcha. Yeah. So for people who are interested in becoming beekeepers, then keep in mind that, like with a lot of things, there are local, state, and national organizations, and other maybe community organizations, like the one that y'all started with your church and things like that. That's a really good set of resources for people to understand. And I love that you mentioned that it's locale based, because if someone here in Tennessee is wanting to be a beekeeper, there's definitely different information than folks in other parts of the country, which is an important thing. And therefore goes back to having those local state organizations is really great. When you started, you mentioned that part of the reason was that you wanted to have a more edible garden and things like that. So what are some benefits of having bees?
I think there were some initial goals for us, just trying to learn a lot about bees. Bee biology and bee management are 2 different things. And we thought it was all about just managing bees. But in essence, you really need to know the life cycle of bees and what they need, and in terms of nourishment and all that. So that was just the learning part of it, was something that was really important to us. And then, of course, you think, well, eventually it'd be really nice to have some honey. Everybody likes honey. Maybe we could share that as gifts. So it became a sort of a side goal. But then, the real problem is just keeping bees alive sometimes. And so it's frequently said that you should start with 2 colonies instead of just 1, just in case one fails, one can maybe help support the other. So a goal about 2 years in, after we failed for 1 year, we said, I think we should set a goal to figure out how to keep these bees alive. That's more important than anything else. So we learned a lot about how to manage bees better and help them along, because it's not that obvious, but one of the side benefits that we realized years later is that having this hobby put us in touch with other people that were also interested in the kinds of things that we're interested in. And they're curious just like we are. When people knock on the door, they know that we've got honey, or they hear that we might have honey. It becomes it becomes sort of a fun thing to be able to share with other people the information. They always want to ask questions, and it's not a burden to us to share that. We're excited about it, and we have become friends with people that are just avid learners like us that we would not have met anywhere else. So that this community of people that in Murfreesboro we would never have met, not just in our neighborhood, but people that find us.
Oh, that's really neat. As a lifelong learner and the host of a show all about lifelong learning, that really speaks to me. So I love that, and that human connection because of this passion that you all have found. That's really neat. Well, speaking of the honey, so when I think about bees, I certainly start thinking about the products, right? So you said bee management, obviously keeping the bees alive. That when you're beekeepers, you want to keep them alive. But then you think, okay, but then what's the kind of the down the road or the end result? Well, the end result to me, like I said, I start thinking about the products. So honey, obviously, but I know there are things like candles made of beeswax and all that kind of stuff. So you mentioned that y'all do have honey that you gift and things. Do you use other parts of the honeycomb, the make beeswax? I don't know enough about it to ask maybe the right questions, but I think you can probably answer the question with your knowledge.
First and foremost, you want to make sure that if bees are raising enough honey to support themselves through the winter, you need to make sure that you leave enough honey on the hive so that they won't starve at the end of the winter, going into the spring. Generally, at least in our area of Tennessee, bees have enough resources in just the month of April and May to create enough honey to last them until the very next spring. It's amazing to think about. And usually there's a surplus for us to take and to share. So that's called robbing the honey, but it sounds terrible, but we tend to make sure that they have enough to sustain themselves through the winter. Then you mentioned wax products. Well, wax is a valuable resource. It's also a little messy. It's a little bit of a pain to work with, but we're learning more about doing that. And we'll share sometimes the kids in our fellowship group at St. Paul's. The kids want to do that. It's part of their crafts and they're learning about it. So we're happy to just donate the wax to the kids so that they can make some candles or some lip balm and things like that. So there's different recipes online that you can use, and you use a certain amount of wax for that. And the other product, it's kind of a strange thing to think about, but in the springtime, if you only want to maintain, let's say 3 or 4 colonies, that's really hard to do when you're keeping your bees alive, because in the spring they want to reproduce, and that means they're going to send out these swarms. So what we try to do is we try to make sure that we do artificial swarms. That's called splitting a colony. Before they get to an absolute swarm mode, we try to make sure we take that mated queen and put her into another box. We give her enough bees and emerging bees to support her, and then what's left will be queen cells, and we'll have another colony. The problem is, if you only want to have 3 or 4 colonies, that's almost impossible to do unless you are going to sell bees. So we've gotten to the point where, in order to keep our numbers down so that we don't go crazy, only working on bees all of our lives, and keep our hobby, in check a little bit, we'll put ads out on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace and provide nucleus colonies to new beekeepers or beekeepers that were unsuccessful keeping their bees alive, or they're wanting to grow their apiary. It's a strange thing to say that part of your apiary becomes a product, but if you are interested in finding a mentor in beekeeping, the thing to look for is a beekeeper that has too many bees in the spring. And that's kind of where we've been in the past few years. We've been able to keep our bees alive, and then they want to reproduce in the spring. So we have to do something about that, or we'll just wind up being sideline beekeepers with 200 colonies. We don't want that.
Yeah. So currently, how many colonies and bees do you have right now?
So we have, at the moment, I've checked them when I just look and see, oh yeah, they're flying when it's warm enough. I can see that we still have about a dozen colonies, and that's more than we started with last spring. We had 9 last spring, and I think the year before that we had 6. So you can kind of see where things are going, and that's with parting with some of our nucleus colonies. So we're trying to make sure that we continue to suppress the numbers in a good way, and try to make sure we don't have the neighborhood all concerned about having too many bees in the neighborhood.
Yeah. And so how much time in a given week do you spend on beekeeping tasks? And I think with what you were saying with the spring, so does that mean that you also have more work in the spring?
That's absolutely the way it is. And so the answer to your question again is it depends. If it's early spring and the bees are, able to forage a lot, and they're bringing in pollen from the flowering trees and plants and weeds and all, and they're bringing in nectar from those plants, then yes, absolutely, they're going to be growing, and their population is going to explode. And so pretty quickly, you find that if you don't get into your bees every week, that you're going to find that they're in swarm mode, and you're probably going to lose some bees to the trees. So about every 5 days, we're trying to make an inspection during the months of really late March all the way into mid-May. About every 5 or 6 days, we're trying to open up each colony and make sure that they're not going to swarm, and also be prepared in case they are going to swarm. And it settles down in the summertime. There's if we take some honey, then it means that we're going to have a kitchen full of boxes of honey, and that has to get processed, and then those boxes get put back on the colonies or stored. And that can be maybe, depends on how much honey comes off. It might be 2 or 3 days worth of work, spinning out the honey in extractors and then storing it in buckets, waiting to be bottled. And then later in the year, it's maybe we're going to visit the colonies every 2 weeks or so later in the summer.
The honey, you said that being processed and then jarred, is that something that you all do yourselves, or do you send it off for that? So it's all stuff you do?
Yeah, we don't have a honey house. We don't need to have anything like that. So all we're doing is we're spinning it out in a centrifuge that's made for this purpose, and then it strains through a filter. It's not heated or compressed in any way. It's not treated in any way, and then it just has to, by gravity, it's going into buckets. So it's nice and clean, and we haven't done anything to do that except go through a mesh screen. And then in the winter time, right now, there's nothing to do. So it seems like we're lazy beekeepers because we don't have much to do. But that would be a time to spend more time researching, reading, having interviews with people like you and sharing information, maybe repairing equipment or ordering new equipment if things are, if you find that you're going to be needing more for the spring, more things.
I know we are rapidly running out of time, but one other question that I'd love to ask is around the honey is, I know there are different kinds, and like when I've bought it, like at farmers markets and stuff like that, I always try to get the wildflower honey, but I know there's also clover honey. What's really the difference that people should know, and why would you want one or the other?
I guess the short answer is, if you know that almost all of your honey is coming from a certain floral source, then you're able to say, this is X, Y, or Z honey, like orange blossom honey. If you were in Florida, you might be able to say, well, there's acres and acres of orange blossoms, and so all of this is going to be orange blossom honey, especially if the honey was taken when the orange trees were in bloom. That's true of a lot of places. If a commercial beekeeper goes and takes their hives to a certain location for pollination purposes, then they could say, oh, this is thus and such type of honey. In our area, we don't move our bees around. So it's whatever Murfreesboro has in flower at different times of year. When there's a surplus, when we call it the honey flow, it's actually the nectar flow. When there's a surplus of nectar that the bees aren't ever going to use all of that in a given year. So they're going to turn that into honey after they've gathered it. Well, in our area, that's going to be everything, because we have neighbors that are planting varietals, all kinds of ornamentals. So we would call that wildflower honey, because we can't say it's anything specific. And I think that's one of the reasons Middle Tennessee honey is so tasty, is that it's got a lot of complexity. It has a lot of floral sources.
Huh, very interesting. Well, thank you for that. Before I ask my last question, I will let you share. Are there any other tips or thoughts that we didn't cover? I know there's a lot of stuff we didn't cover, but any last thing or two for people who just thirst for knowledge or maybe thinking about beekeeping that you want to share?
If I were offering any piece of advice to a new beekeeper, it's be patient, be persistent, be flexible and don't be arrogant about knowing too much, because it's very common for people to think they're going to get into something that's all fun, and they don't realize how much information they need to gather and how much flexibility they need to assume that they're wrong a good bit of the time. And they need to learn what is important and what's really not that important. Probably about one out of every 4 beekeepers persists beyond the second year, I would say. It's very common for people to just drop out because it's just too frustrating. They find that they don't have enough time to do it justice, or they think that it was going to be a lot easier and they aren't going to need to know very much. In our case, we just have really been interested in learning more and more about them, because every time we go into a colony, we learn something new. And that's the exciting part.
Awesome. Well, the last question that I always ask my guests is, what is something that you are learning or interested in currently? And so obviously you've got your musical side of your life, you've got the beekeeping. Maybe it's something to do with one of those. Maybe it's something completely different that you want to share. But what's something that's interesting in that you are spending time learning currently?
Well, on a completely different note, at St. Paul's, we started a discussion group and a reading group related to race relations, especially since George Floyd and in the COVID and post-COVID period. And so we've interacted with some folks from different churches. We've visited some of the African-American churches, and just trying to learn more and more about the day-to-day life that African Americans in our area face. And I think it's really important to be involved in something like that in this day and age. So without getting too far into it, we've just learned a ton from other people and from different authors that have a lot to say on the subject. And that's kind of has been our more recent passion, is just learning more and trying to put ourselves in the shoes of our African American brothers and sisters.
What a compassionate endeavor. That's really cool. Well, I really, really appreciate your time today. I feel like we could probably talk for another hour or more. I could probably have a list of questions and all, but I want to finish up by saying that if folks are interested in learning more, that really reiterating that the sources that they should go to is look for their local organizations, community organizations, local, county, state organizations, and really do their homework before they get started.
That sounds like a good plan.
I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and Happy New Year.
You too.
One of the pieces of my conversation with Dave that I think is a great tie back to L&D is the concept of first mastering the art of keeping bees alive, then starting to grow the colonies, harvest the honey, and so on. In organizations, we sometimes forget to ensure that our workforce has mastered the basics of their role, a new system, or leading people before trying to teach them or expect them to flourish in a higher capacity. Setting employees up with a foundation, starting with onboarding and continuing throughout the duration of their employment, building on their knowledge, skills, and attitudes, can set everyone up for successful, thriving communities, or should I say colonies. We could learn a lot from bees and their keepers. Thank you again to my guest, David Loucky. And don't forget that instead of an episode sponsor today, we encourage you to check out your local beekeeping associations for information specific to your area. And thank you for tuning in once again.
You've been listening to One More Thing, a radio show on the Power Me Up radio station on iHeartRadio. I'm your host, Kiffin McCoy Albert. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to you tuning in next time as we continue cultivating your mind with one more thing.